coming to my presentation. It is my last semester at the University of Kansas, and I'm very excited about the opportunity to work for the Foreign Military Studies Office. I can tell you that it so far has been one of my favorite semesters because it actually allowed me to approach the topic that I have been thinking about for a very long time. Today I will be focusing more on the kind of empirical part of my research, and I will talk just a little bit about the theory and context that I'm approaching in this research, but I will mainly talk about the research findings. I'll be talking today about the Sea Breeze. It's the largest naval international military exercise in the Black Sea region, and I'm approaching this topic by using two contexts. I'm looking at the broader context of Ukraine relationships with NATO, and I'm also looking at the Black Sea security. If you look at these photos, they come from a book that was published in Ukraine by several politicians in 2009, right before the presidential elections. Elections that resulted in the election of Viktor Yanukovych as the president of Ukraine. This is the most stereotypical portrayal of the public opinion in Ukraine about Ukraine's relationship with NATO. If you look at these two photos, you can see that one of them is very much directed against NATO. It's a very harsh emotional propaganda directed to kind of stop Ukraine's intentions in Euro-Atlantic way. And the other one comes from the western region of Ukraine, and it's more about the value of Ukraine relationships with NATO. I believe that this portrayal is very true, however, it's very limited because it doesn't go in depth, and it's pretty much treating East and center of Ukraine as one whole region without thinking about regional diversities within the region. And it's treating west of Ukraine as one whole region. So that's part of the problem that I'm raising in this paper. If you look at numerous public perception polls, and one of them, it's been recently released by the Democratic Initiatives Foundation, it's talking about the public's opinion about accession to NATO. And obviously there is a lot of people who don't support Ukrainians' accession to NATO, but there is some people who do. And what I'm interested in, I'm really interested in this proportion of people who are undecided, who haven't made their mind about whether NATO membership is good for Ukraine is bad. Why? Because I believe it's harder to change the opinion of people who already made up their minds. But I think with providing enough information, we can work with people who are undecided, who are such a significant proportion of the Ukrainian population. And I believe that research on Sea Breeze contributes to better understanding of public opinion about NATO. So what exactly is the Sea Breeze? As I mentioned, it's the largest naval exercise in the Black Sea region. Stereotypically, people think about it as a NATO exercise, but it's not really a NATO exercise. It's a dual intention of United States and Ukraine. And by now, the exercise became multilateral. It involves other countries in the Black Sea region. Its goal is to improve maritime safety, security, and stability, and it has been conducted in Ukraine since 1997, and there were a couple of years where there were huge public protests against Sea Breeze that led to the cancellation of this exercise. Why is it important to study Sea Breeze? Well, first, I believe that Sea Breeze can inform our views about United States naval diplomacy in the Black Sea region. Second, I believe it's important for Ukraine because by looking at Sea Breeze, we kind of can connect Sea Breeze with the idea of maritime power. And we can see how exercises such as Sea Breeze contribute to the development of Ukrainian maritime power. And finally, it has a policy significance. By learning about public opinion, we can hopefully devise and develop better informational campaigns. This is the Black Sea region. I'm not going to delve on this map too much, but obvious observation is that there are so many countries, littoral states and states around the Black Sea involved in all sorts of security issues in this region. It's a very complex region. In fact, in the literature, it's considered one of the most heterogeneous and complex areas in the wider Europe. It struggles with a number of security issues, and that's why every country is important. The capacity of each country to address all of the security issues is important for the security in the region as a whole. I am kind of, in my paper, I'm talking about the new security paradigm and how the new security paradigm justifies the United States involvement in the region, as well as considering Ukraine as an important state providing for the regional security. The new security paradigm talks about regionalization of the global security, which justifies the involvement of all states around the world in specific regional security issues. So in other words, it justifies the involvement of United States in the Black Sea affairs. The new security paradigm also indicates the greater shift towards cooperative security in the region. That's where Black Sea comes into play. And finally, there is a theory of maritime power that believes that the maritime power of each individual single state consists of both quantitative elements, traditional elements, and qualitative elements. And as part of the qualitative element of maritime power is the personnel, training, and morale. And that's exactly where Sea Breeze comes in play, because it directly addresses this element of maritime power. And also, another element is internal state dynamics, and that's where public perceptions come into play. I can tell you that I found only one case study specifically dedicated to Sea Breeze in Ukraine. It's written by Deborah Sanders. Dr. Sanders examined Sea Breeze in 2006. This is the year when Sea Breeze was actually canceled because of the massive problems, internal and external problems. And findings of Deborah Sanders basically say that Sea Breeze failure was the result of the lack of coordination of different political forces within Ukraine and different levels of government, as well as not so wise involvement of United States in that specific case. What I argue that this is only part of the story. I would say that public perceptions and public protest against Sea Breeze is as powerful of a factor that explains failings or successes of Sea Breeze as the internal institutional dynamics or the involvement of foreign actors. So these are the two questions that I'm addressing in this research project. First, I was interested to look at over time dynamics of public perception change regarding Sea Breeze, and second, I was interested in looking at more in-depth regional variations of public perceptions regarding Sea Breeze exercises. The methodology that I'm using, it's a qualitative methodology. I use media analysis of Sea Breeze related publications that I found in EastView database. I worked with Ukrainian and Russian language publications from 4 regional newspapers and 2 national newspapers. In total, I did frequency analysis, which is more quantitative, but I also looked at more in-depth analysis, content analysis of these publications. And I pre-coded the entire set of 207 articles found in these papers about Sea Breeze, but I also made a sample, selected a sample of 100 articles, and I coded them in greater details. I'm looking at 3 time periods here. The period that I call Kuchma Ukraine, the period that I call Orange Revolution Ukraine, after President Yushchenko was elected and became an orange government was in the office, and also post-orange period, 2010 and up to now. So what am I finding? This is just several word clouds based on the regional newspapers, and I'm not going to talk a lot about it because most of my findings about the quality of distinctions, not about the quantity, but I would like just to provide an illustration of how these frequencies inform our opinion about Sea Breeze. For instance, if you look at this word cloud, it comes from a Crimean newspaper, and if you can see which words are most prominent, aside from Crimea and Sea Breeze and some of these traditional topics, you could see a theme that indicates a huge prominence of public protest, kind of emotional type of protest against Sea Breeze, as illustrated by words protest, against, military, NATO, training. But if you look, for instance, at this word cloud, it comes from Donetsk newspaper, which is an eastern region of Ukraine, and it's interesting that the word territory here stands out. And as I discuss my findings further, it will become clear what exactly territory means and why it plays so much in this region. This is how coding looks in Blasty. I will not make you look at this picture for a long time, but I just wanted to show you that I have a number of codes, and I managed to analyze and combine these codes in 4 factors that explain public perception of the Sea Breeze. These 4 factors include internal factors that have to do with everything that is happening inside Ukraine that is shaping public perceptions, external factors, which includes Russia's involvement of Russian media, involvement of United States, NATO, and some of these other external topics. I also have arguments in support of sea breeze that people use across all of these different regions. And the most interesting category is really arguments against or in support of sea breeze. That's where I get to regional variations. It's fascinating that the same sort of ideas that we would think of as facts were used in completely opposite directions depending on the region. As an example, for instance, tourism industry or local economy. The newspaper that is one of the national newspapers as well as newspaper from Lviv essentially talks about the benefits of sea breeze for the local economy. Because the image of Ukraine, we get a better image of Ukraine, we attract foreign direct investments, we popularize tourism in Crimea, people learn more about this region and they are more inclined to actually invest in local economy. On the contrary, the same argument is used in a totally opposite direction in, for instance, Crimean newspaper that literally says that sea breeze has a very negative impact on the development of local economy and tourism because it disattracts tourists, it scares them away, the fact of military presence on the territory. So that's where most of my findings come from, this kind of analysis of arguments that are used differently in different regions. Let's talk a little bit about general findings. There are several themes that cut across all of these newspapers that I would like to mention. The first one is the lack of political consensus regarding sea breeze among different political parties between different levels of government, national versus regional, as well as between different branches of government, parliament versus president. And this finding is very consistent with the previous literature. That's what most of the people are talking about, that failings of sea breeze are basically failings of coordination between different levels of government. What I'm also finding, I am finding that all newspapers acknowledge a very important role of local political parties, especially communists and progressive socialists. They acknowledge the roles of grassroots organizations and church, in this case Russian Orthodox Church, plays as a powerful actor in shaping public opinion about the sea breeze. I also find a general sense of the lack of information about sea breeze, which in my opinion is a very alarming finding, because sea breeze has been happening in Ukraine since 1997, and up to now there is still an indication that people don't know anything or know very little about sea breeze and have all sorts of misconceptions. In some of the newspapers, people even call this problem secrecy. They feel that government is keeping a secret about real intentions about sea breeze, or government directly misinforms them. Which is something that I believe should be addressed at the policy level. And finally, there are conflicting goals about the general purpose of the sea breeze depending on the region. Is sea breeze a military operation with hidden intelligence purposes, or is it an educational training program? And that's the theme that's kind of muddled through and discussed in all of these papers. Let's talk a little bit about region-specific findings. I don't have time to really go and talk about all of the region-specific findings, but for the sake of this presentation, I would like to identify, let's say, one or two main themes per region and tell you about it. So if we look at Lviv newspaper, this is newspaper published in the western region of Ukraine, then we can see that when this paper discusses sea breeze, it makes a huge emphasis on the national interest of Ukraine and what is important for Ukraine in the long term. To that extent, the paper calls the government for conducting sea breeze without interruption, even regardless of the negative public perception, because it is important for the national interest of Ukraine and it is important for Ukrainians in the long run. There is a huge irony towards protesters, especially in Crimea, found in Lviv newspaper. People in the western part of Ukraine kind of blame protesters for their Soviet sentiment. They call them communists supporting Russian brothers, and even local Crimean criminals who are trying to get rid of any kind of foreign presence in Crimea, and that's why they are protesting against sea breeze. This portrayal is very different in a newspaper called Donbass. It's a newspaper published in Donetsk, which is the eastern region of Ukraine. All topics, kind of, general protest topics that are prominent in other newspapers, they are prominent in this newspaper as well. However, the main argument that this newspaper seems to be making is not against sea breeze per se, because we don't like it and we don't like the presence of foreigners. But this newspaper objects against how the decision was made about conducting sea breeze in Ukraine, which is very interesting. There is a theme, people versus government, running in this newspaper all the time, and the idea that despite the civil society protests that happen in the southern part of Ukraine, national government still ignored the will of people and it still decided to conduct sea breeze. There is also a very strong sense of regionalism that feeds into this anti-sea breeze propaganda and talks about the idea that local government should be the ultimate decider of whether the foreign military should be present on its territory or not. And finally, this paper calls protesters active civil society and supports them very much. It acknowledges the positive role of local media and grassroots organizations, and it generally appeals to broader democratic ethos, such as freedom of speech and freedom of public protests and the ability of people to decide the destiny of their region. Вечерний Kharkiv, that's another Eastern newspaper. However, as you can see, the portrayal of the sea breeze critique is slightly different. I mean, there are some of the same themes found here, but Kharkiv newspaper is very much more emotional, provides a much more emotional coverage and very negative coverage about sea breeze. And here, Kharkiv newspaper has a lot of the discussions about Ukrainian military complex as well as about Ukrainian army and whether sea breeze is good or bad for Ukrainian military complex and Ukrainian army. It literally calls sea breeze an invasion of Ukrainian territory, foreign invasion of the territory, and it appeals to broader public sentiment and historical memory about the Second World War when Soviet Union and their allies won over Nazi Germany. And there are all kinds of analogies used to kind of relate to this historic memory to try to persuade people that sea breeze is not a good thing. And this paper also prioritizes Ukraine-Russia relations, saying that as long as Russia is against sea breeze, Ukraine shouldn't conduct it. Another regional newspaper from Crimea, it has a very emotional coverage as well. There is a strong fear of the foreign capture of Ukrainian territory, as well as a strong sense of regionalism and advocacy of stronger ties with Russia, and very prominent war rhetoric. So this paper has a very similar portrayal to Kharkiv with several exceptions. I would say it's stronger on the idea of regionalism, and it criticizes the fact that national government steps in and makes the decisions that local government doesn't support and local people don't support. This is one of the national newspapers that I looked at. This is the newspaper of Ukrainian Parliament. So it's kind of a more neutral pro-governmental newspaper, but I believe it's still important to look at the publications in this paper because in some periods of time that I'm looking at, the government was divided with parliamentary majority supporting one side of the story and president supporting another side of the story. So it's still valuable to look at this paper. What we can see, an interesting theme here, that public protesters are portrayed as outcomes of the political struggle between the parties, rather than any kind of grassroots civil society involvement. That's kind of the theme that runs across publications of this paper. And there is also quite a strong critique of government's inability to find funds for the informational campaigns, which kind of is expected because it's a national paper and it has to think about public involvement. And this paper also highlights, when talking about benefits about sea breeze, it doesn't talk about national interest and some of these grand ideas. It talks more about instrumental benefits from sea breeze. Expertise, free training for Ukraine, benefits for tourism and economy, and Ukraine's image abroad. The other newspaper, I would say it's the most objective, kind of accurate newspaper providing the most accurate coverage. It's called Zerkalo Nedeli. It's an analytical national newspaper, and not surprisingly, the coverage is very balanced and it's mostly educational. This is the newspaper that talks about sea breeze as a collaborative project with the United States, not a NATO program. This is the only newspaper that made it clear. There is a critique of undecisive Ukrainian politicians, which is consistent with findings in the previous literature, and there is also condemnation of the idea of regionalism and emphasis on the national interest. So as you can see, this newspaper takes a more balanced position. It critiques everyone. It critiques government for their undecisiveness, but it also critiques local governments and local grassroots organizations for not supporting such an important strategic priority for Ukraine. The other thing that I looked at the changes over time, and I'll be happy to provide some illustrations if we have time, but I personally disliked that finding because I joined the Orange government right after Orange Revolution, and I didn't want to find this, but I kind of found it, so I have to present it. But what I found is that I wasn't able to really look at Kuchma's period because I only had 4 publications, but I did have a decent number of publications in Yushchenko's Ukraine or Viktor Yanukovych's Ukraine. So what I am finding is that assertive pro-Western foreign policy agenda of President Yushchenko provoked more public resistance and massive protests and harsher critique of sea breeze in eastern and southern regions of Ukraine. At the same time, later on, a more moderate position of President Viktor Yanukovych, who started re-establishing and redeveloping relations with Russia, as well as adopting the non-alignment paradigm as a paradigm of national security in relation to NATO, I could see that the public reporting improved. So people didn't start supporting sea breeze, but their critique became more rational, more pragmatic rather than emotional. And there could be several explanations for this, but I could think of an explanation that very strong pro-Western assertive agenda in a divided country of Ukraine can probably do more disservice than service in such important issues as NATO, relations with NATO, or generally Euro-Atlantic integration. So what are my research implications? These are the main research implications. First, I concluded that Ukraine has a long way to go. Ukraine has a long way to go in conducting public information campaigns as well as providing sufficient institutional support for such important trainings as sea breeze, especially because foreign military training constitutes about 25% of all of the military training in Ukraine, which is one course. It's quite fascinating. I also find that East-West divide is oversimplified. We shouldn't really, I didn't have many newspapers from the West, but based on the southern and eastern newspapers, I can see that we shouldn't really treat east of Ukraine as a uniform region. The story is more complex, and to be able to succeed on our path to Euro integration, we have to make sure that we are addressing a broader range of regional concerns as well as both security and non-security issues. And finally, I conclude that pursuing a one-sided assertive foreign policy agenda in a geopolitically divided country like Ukraine probably does more disservice to Ukraine and to its maritime power in general. My research, of course, has several limitations that I have to acknowledge. Mainly, these are limitations of time and data. I had an uneven number of publications in different time periods, and with the database that I used, there was no way to get around it. I have different quality, scope, and thematic emphasis in all of these newspapers selected, which kind of potentially limits some of my conclusions. And I also don't have publications since the beginning of the sea breeze exercise because EastView database doesn't have them, and I also suspect that many newspapers probably didn't publish some of their publications online because internet was still a scarcity in Ukraine in 1997. So that all tells you that my conclusions are rather suggestive than conclusive. However, they are important, let's say, hypotheses for future research. And as future opportunities, I probably would like to do an analysis of public blogs, which I think would be interesting because newspapers, they are representative of public opinion, but it's not exactly the same. And it would be interesting to see if the analysis of public blogs would give consistent conclusions. And finally, I think using a more direct research method, surveys or in-person interviews would be beneficial. Finally, I would like to acknowledge Chris, Dr. Maria Nelicheva, and also Foreign Military Studies Office, Ray Finch, and Tom Wilhelm for helping me to narrow down my research project because I had a giant idea of looking into Ukraine-NATO relationships, which wasn't very productive or interesting. So thank you very much. If you're interested in my literature reviews and the literature that I used, I posted annotated bibliographies in Chris Fimso website, and I will make my paper available. And I would also like to thank Vincent Ardman for listening to my arguments and providing his feedback, and also Bart for suggesting a couple of interesting titles for my presentation that I didn't have time to bring up, but that was very helpful as well. Thank you.